Okay, I'm John Inscoe in the History Department at UGA, and we're conducting a oral history interview this morning on May the 9th, 2016, with author Jim Grimsley of Emory University. We are talking about his recent memoir that was published just this past year, entitled How I Shed My Skin, Unlearning the Racist Lessons of a Southern Childhood. Jim, welcome to Athens.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And it's a wonderful memoir, and much to talk about with it. I'm looking forward to this. Let me start by saying, as a fiction writer who novels, short stories, plays, I'm wondering what it was that drove you, or actually drew you, back into, or maybe for the first time, into a work of nonfiction, a memoir.
I kind of backed into this. I had an idea to write a memoir for about the school desegregation in North Carolina for a while, but I was afraid to do it because I had written so much autobiographical fiction about my early years. I come from a really poor family with a classically Southern Gothic dysfunctional background. And I was afraid if I tried to write a memoir about these years, I would end up rehashing a lot of family material. So I was very shy to do that. And so my original version of this book was a novel, in fact.
Oh, really?
I wrote a novel, a full-length 400-page manuscript.
Really?
About the early part of this memoir, the part through the freedom of choice years, the years of token desegregation. And I sent that to my publisher, Algonquin Books, and their reaction to it was sort of meh, you know, this is promising, but you're going to have to do a lot of work on it to make it work. And the kind of work that they described that they wanted me to do on it was problematic in my view, because what they wanted was, the suggestion was that the little white protagonist, who was a surrogate for me, should have a black best friend, should attend church with black people, should become a kind of a little white hero of desegregation. And that was precisely the territory I wanted to avoid, because that is the classic way that white people do write about these years. You know, they talk about themselves as not being part of the problem, and my memories of what I had been like as a child were very different from that. So I mulled over what my editor had told me to do for a while and thought, I actually started the rewrite, and then I thought, well, I'm just going to write a nonfiction version and see how that goes. Because I was not at all comfortable with his advice to me was, you're sticking too close to the facts, and that was exactly what I wanted to do. So I thought, well, if I write a memoir, they can't tell me I'm sticking too close to the facts, because that's my goal then. So I just started writing my memories of every intersection I had had with black people, beginning as far back as I could go. And that took maybe a year to write. The novel had taken a couple of years to write, but this went much faster. And when I sent that to my editor, they reacted very differently. They said, oh, this is good. They really liked it. This is simple, it's clean. We've never really read anybody write about race this way as a white person. So let's see if we can't reshape it to be more dramatic. And so then they asked me if I would reshape the book. And coincidentally, the thing that they asked me to start with was the chapter in which I called one of the first black girls I met in elementary school. When I called her a name, I called her a black bitch. And that was the way I'd started the novel. So it seemed right, and dramatic. So I reshaped the book, and then they accepted it. Now it's a book.
That's very interesting. How much of a challenge was it do you approach as a writer material differently or write in a different way in producing nonfiction?
Well, I do because my habits have all been formed by fiction.
Right.
So I used to say when I was in the middle of working on this book that this was the least fun I'd ever had with writing, because I kept having everything. Writing fiction is fun. I get to make stuff up.
It's very liberating.
Right. But writing a memoir, what I had to do was sit on myself and go, no, you can't elaborate on this. You can't make anything up. You can't embroider. You can't write funny dialogue that didn't actually happen. So basically, my usual habit is to work on several projects at the same time. While I was working on the memoir, I had to just work on the memoir and nothing else, because everything else that I could think to do was more fun than actually writing the memoir. But I think that's a peculiarity of this material also, because it was what I'm really writing about is my own realization at, I guess, 11 years old that I was a bigot. And that I had to work myself out of it. Had to try to deal with my racism as best I could, and that's not a very easy thing.
Right.
I mean, there are places in the book where I write about myself in ways that are pretty uncomfortable. So I struggled with that and had to go through it again and again and again to make sure that I got it as close to the truth as I could get it.
You do it beautifully, and I think this is one thing that sets your memoir apart from so many others on that, and we want to pursue that more. I'm always amazed at the degree of memory it takes to pull this back. You obviously have a very sharp memory. Were there any tricks you used to sort of pull those memories out or bring them into focus?
I meditated on the moments that I wanted to bring back, but the best technique that I used, the most successful strategy for recovering the memory, was simply writing the book over and over again. Writing it the first time brought up a certain layer of memory. Writing it the second time brought up even more memory. I was reluctant to talk to people.
I wondered about that.
About the book. I did a little bit of that, but not very much. I didn't do anything like interviewing friends. There were a couple of points that I had to check on. But every time I checked on something, it turned out that my memory was correct. I'll give you an example. There's the part in the book where I got off the school bus and my brother was fighting with a little black boy in the yard, and my mother was working dry tobacco, grating dry tobacco in our house with a black woman helping her. And I asked Mom if she remembered that. And the first time I asked her, she said no, and she didn't think anything like that would have happened, because it was very unusual to invite a black person into your house for any reason if you were a white person in that era, unless they were your servant or something like that. And of course my family is far too poor to afford help that way. So I was a little disturbed by that, because my memory of it was so clear that I didn't want to back down from it. So I was thinking, well, I guess I'll have to say in the book that I remember this, but my mother doesn't, or something on that order. Because I also tried to make the process of memory a part of the memoir.
Comes through. Right.
But then about 6 months later, she brought it up to me again. She said, you know, I do remember that now, right? Because she was almost 80 at that point.
Oh, really?
Right?
Yeah.
So she also had to recover the memory. She said that was probably a time when the farmer whose tobacco she was helping out with had a big deadline to get the tobacco to market. So he had brought the woman to help her at our house. I mean, this was a reflection on the way people lived in that time. They had stored a whole couple of pallets of dry tobacco in our living room for us to grate. And if you've ever seen dry tobacco when it comes out of a drying barn, it's dusty and it's dirty and I know my mother wouldn't have liked that, and that's what made her remember it ultimately, was the fact that it messed her house up so much.
And that strong odor. That
Strong, very strong odor.
Yeah. Well, we probably should situate your story, where and when we're talking about.
Right.
Should probably started that. This is Eastern North Carolina. You do a really good job of establishing place.
I've written a lot about Eastern North Carolina. The book takes place in Jones County, North Carolina, during the years 1966 through 1973.
Your middle school and high school years.
Right.
Or junior high.
Although middle school, we never talked about middle school in those years.
Junior high.
It was elementary school, and then they called it junior high, but that was the first junior high there had ever been in the county that I went to. So Jones County is a tiny county. Well, it's not tiny acreage-wise, but it's a very sparsely populated county, about an hour, if that much, from the beach. It's in the extreme eastern part of North Carolina. It was
New Bern would be the closest.
New Bern is the closest city, right?
Yeah.
And I grew up along Highway 17, which is a road that a lot of people know. There were about 10,000 people in the town. At the time when I was living there, about 60% of the population was black. There were 2 school systems in operation. In every town there was a black elementary school and a white elementary school, 8 grades of students in one building, 1 high school for the white students in one part of the county, and 1 high school for black students a few miles away from there.
Right.
So when desegregation happened, the process the county went through was to close all of the schools and reopen them, many of them with new names. The leaders of the county, whether they did this because they were smart or just because they didn't have any other choice, I'm not sure, but the most important step they took that helped us in desegregation was to close the high schools, not to bring the black students into the white high school. That was a strategy a lot of counties around us tried, and it was not a very good strategy because they had the same old mascots, the same history. The feeling was that the black people were being treated as second-class people because they were in white territory. Right. Whereas in Jones County, we had a new high school name, new mascots, new history. We felt as if we were all starting over again. Yeah. And I think that was a very smart thing.
And any sense of how those or where those decisions were made? Was it a county school board, superintendent? Was it a committee?
It has to have been that. Nobody has really talked to me about that stuff. Yeah. And I haven't done a lot of digging, frankly, because that's not actually within the scope of the book. Right. What I'm trying to write in the book is exactly what I knew as an 11-year-old through a high school graduate.
And I think you do that well, pull yourself back into that mindset.
But as I've talked to people, there was a great deal more turmoil behind the scenes than we knew about, especially within the school board and the school administration there. So I do expect those decisions were made there. But as it happens, the federal judge who ordered desegregation in all of the eastern North Carolina counties that were under the jurisdiction of his court lived in Jones County.
Oh, really?
Judge Larkin was his name. Yeah. And I suspect his presence there had quite an effect on people. Yeah.
Well, I was growing up a little older. I think I'm 3 years older than you are, and from Morganton, in western part of the state. Right. And so it was very interesting to me to read how this compared to what we were going through in our part of the state. Far lower black population, only 10 to 12%.
Was it the same years for you?
No, it was 3 years or 4 years earlier. I was in the class of 70. And I was curious about that, why that would have happened sooner. And I wonder if it was because it was less tension, less of an adjustment for that to absorb a smaller
This was all done county by county.
Yeah.
It depended on whatever judge was in charge of the decision making in where you lived and where I lived. Yeah. It depended. Each school district was required to submit a separate plan for desegregation. So the timetable is different no matter, there were dozens of adjustments in timetable all over eastern North Carolina. In general, I think the western counties did integrate earlier than the eastern counties did. As you know, if you grew up in that era, white people fought desegregation for as long as they possibly could, and using every strategy that they could.
Right.
And so it was the delaying tactics that caused some places had a certain level of enlightenment or a sense of reality that told them this change is coming, so we might as well go ahead and go with it. But most places, especially places that were more rural and where the concentration of black population was really high, that those were the areas I think that resisted integration as long as they possibly could, and that's what happened with us.
And I think it was fairly across the board throughout the South, certainly in North Carolina, to begin with this token integration of freedom of choice.
That was one of the Southern strategies. I would imagine that came out of those old, I can't remember what they're called, the community groups. They were I can't think of the name. The citizens councils.
White citizens.
I would imagine that was a heritage from those groups, that was a strategy they all agreed on, because it was practiced nearly all throughout the South to a degree that in 1968, I believe, the Supreme Court ruled on that notion of freedom of choice and said this is not going to do the job. And that was what finally brought an end to freedom of choice programs.
So in the beginning, the strategy was this might be all it'll take.
Right.
We can settle for this, claim we have met the law in that way. Well, can you talk a little about the specifics there? We're talking your 6th grade, 1966. You're 11 years old.
Yeah.
And this is your first chapter.
We had heard over the summer that schools were going to be completely integrated. Over that summer, all over eastern North Carolina, church-related private schools opened. So that by the time schools opened in late August, a third to a half of the white students that I'd gone to school with since I was a first grader were in public school. Let's hang on for a second. I need to back up. Freedom of choice was different. I'm jumping 2 years ahead. Right. In 6th grade, we had heard that we were going to have black children in our classrooms. So I went to school for the first day, and 3 black girls walked into the class, escorted by the principal. This was the first time I had ever had any real interaction with black children other than to see them playing in their yard or to see them in a churchyard, or I wasn't really conscious of them in the stores. Excuse me. Because black people and white people generally shopped in different parts of stores. White people at the front of the store, black people at the back of the store.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And that's the way our town was set up. There was white people were allowed into the front of the stores. There was an entrance at the back of the stores for black people, and a separate counter back there where they got their goods and did their checkout. So these 3 black girls, all my age, walked in. They were dressed for school. They were introduced to us. That one of them sat behind me. Her name in the book is Violet. I changed all the names with the agreement of my publisher because we didn't want to infringe on anybody's privacy in writing the book. So I have to, if I seem to be stopping to remember names, I indeed am, because I have to translate them from their real name to the fictional name. I'm stalling a little bit because this is not an easy story to tell particularly, but I had the impulse to call Violet a name. And I knew it would be funny.
This wasn't the first day, was it?
It might have been the first day, but probably not. It was probably within the first few days of school. But I remember it as being the first day of school. I'm not sure about that, and I said that in the book. But I know it was very, very early in the year, within the first 4 or 5 days of school. So I turned around and I said to her, "You black bitch." And she looked at me and swelled up a little bit and said, "You white cracker bitch." And that sort of took me aback, because it hadn't occurred to me that she would talk back. And then she looked at me and said, "You didn't think I'd say that, did you?" And all of a sudden it was her who was getting the laughs, not me, right? And she was embarrassing me, and I felt a complete turnaround.
This is in a room of about 30.
A room of about 30 students, all of whom I had been going to school with since first grade, right? Very, very homogenous group of people. So I got through the rest of the day. She didn't tell on me. Nothing happened. She sat behind me the whole day, and I could feel her behind me the whole day. The next day I came to school, and she asked me if I was going to call her any name anymore, and I said, "No, I'm not." And from that point forward, what happened to me in that moment was I understood that, now I couldn't have articulated this at the time, but what I see in the moment, what I wrote about that moment, is that I understood that she was a child just like me. That there was something wrong in what I had been told about white people and black people. Because I had expected her to accept my insult as if she deserved it. I had to have. So this told me that there was something about my assumptions that needed a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so from that point forward, Violet and I got along once she understood that I wasn't going to do that kind of stupid stuff anymore. I became good friends with the other 2 girls.
Who were sisters.
Sisters, right. Yeah. Ursula and Rhonda in the book. And in fact, I'm still friends with them. We're Facebook friends.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Do they still live in the area?
Oh, no. In fact, they had moved to Jones County from Washington, so they had been going to integrated schools already. Oh. They were shocked when they got to Jones County, where their grandparents lived, and discovered that schools were integrated. And they went
segregated.
Segregated, yeah. And they went to segregated schools, I think, for a year before integration happened, and their dad told them right away they were going into the white schools. They were going to be pioneers. And that was just the kind of father they had. He was all about education, and he was going to see to it that his children got the best education they could get.
And as you say, you did become friends with.
Oh yeah, we became very good friends. In fact, the next year in the 7th grade, Ursula kissed me on the cheek one day at the blackboard and shocked the devil out of me. It was my first kiss. It was her first kiss. She just ran up to me and kissed me on the cheek, and then it embarrassed her, and she ran out of the room. And I didn't really know what to make of it, because you weren't supposed to do that in elementary school, not in our little village of Pollocksville. I mean, Pollocksville had 400 people in it. So anything that happened of any stripe in any location was known throughout the town by supper time that evening. So I went up and told the teacher myself what had happened, and her reaction was something like, "Well, you're not going to do it again, are you?" and I said, "No, ma'am," and nothing else happened about it, really. So.
But you learned a lot from those girls, didn't you?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about Ebony and Jet. I think that's very
They brought these magazines. I had some access to magazines down at the drugstore. Look and Life and Time magazine. I didn't buy them, but I would look at them from now and then. So I was aware of these big glossy national magazines. But Donnie and Fernanda in particular would bring in copies of Ebony and copies of Jet. And if white folks may not be so familiar with those magazines, but those were enormously important publications in the black community in that era. And
still are, I think.
Yeah. Especially Ebony, I think.
Yeah.
I don't hear so much about Jet anymore. But there's a lot more out there now. Those were the two magazines that were really important in that era. And of course, this was an era where there was no black television. There may have been a limited amount of black radio, but certainly not where I live. So this was one of the primary ways that black people shared information with one another, through their newspapers and through these magazines, these national magazines. Looking at them, I remember being shocked at seeing black people in suits, black women in nice dresses, sort of like Donna Reed would wear on the Donna Reed show, or Beaver Cleaver's mother would wear. And I remember thinking, not having really a fully formed thought, but just being surprised by the fact of the magazines. And they were full of stories about black power and the civil rights movement. So this was, in fact, my interest. And of course, Donnie would share the magazine. She was glad to let me have one and look at it. And I felt like I was doing something wrong by holding it, because it was full of information that I think a lot of people, especially in my church, would have considered to be subversive. This was the first place that I read about Stokely Carmichael, for instance. The first time I saw the Black Power Fist. And they used to tease us in class about the revolution. Violet and Rhonda and Ursula said, these are the days of the revolution are here, and we're going to get rid of the white people. But she I think it was Rhonda who told me she was going to put me on the list. I would be on the list of white people who wasn't going to get killed.
You'd be spared.
Right.
That's great.
It was fun.
What was it about you? There was and I think you do this in such interesting ways in the book, that you were sort of exceptional in terms of the white students in either reaching out to them or them reaching out to you.
I wouldn't say totally exceptional. The way I would see it was that the change that happened in the class was pretty much immediate. There was the group of white people who accepted them and talked to them and interacted with them just like anybody else would. That was me, maybe one other boy, and a good half of the girls. And then the boys, the white boys in general, the ones who sat at the back of the room, which was most of the white boys, would not interact with them, had sort of a back and forth debate going on with them during those 2 years of freedom of choice.
While they were talking Black Power, the black boys were talking George Wallace. Wait till he takes over.
Right. The South shall rise again.
Yes, right.
That was before George Wallace came along. Then it was all George Wallace. And George Wallace came
by
along.
68.
But I think the way that I was different was, well, first of all, I had hemophilia, so I didn't get properly socialized as a part of the boys group. I think that's one of the reasons I was able to make the change that I made in myself, by opening myself up to these girls, because I wasn't one of the boys, really. And the other difference was that I was gay. Now, I wouldn't have said this at that time, but I knew that there was something about my attraction to boys that I had to keep secret, and that made me different. And that was the difference in the fact that I had to be careful about that I didn't think the rest of the class would accept anything like my having a crush on a boy or wanting a boyfriend. I think that it didn't make an alliance between me and the black girls, but it gave me an empathy for what they were going through, because they were different. They were in a crowd of people where they were not really welcome. And so I think those two, and I think they instinctively understood something like that was true about me. They would probably have pinned it more on my having hemophilia, because I definitely didn't come out through my high school years at all.
You write about that so well, and I imagine a lot of this is hindsight. You're going back and analyzing now things that weren't apparent at the time in terms of at least the reasons or the subtleties of what are going on.
Well, my memories of that era are so clear. Now, particularly now that I've written about them, but even while I was writing about them, the memories were very vivid.
Because this was something exceptional in a way, wasn't it? That it was not the norm, that you would be harder to recreate those first 5 years of school, probably, wouldn't it?
Probably so. Although I think in general, a person's memories of his first 15 or 20 years, those are really clear. It's my real problem would be creating years 20 through 40.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or 50.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's interesting. Well, one of the most valuable parts of the book is you move from that section of those 2 years, 66 through 68, 6th grade and 7th grade, and then pull back to go into what your subtitle is, Unlearning the Racist Lessons of a Southern Childhood.
Right.
In which you look at how you were preconditioned.
Right.
What was it that made you make these assumptions and to make, by implication, other white children your age of that generation, they are preconditioned to assume these girls are inferior, as any black children would be. And this is a familiar theme in Southern autobiography, I'm sure you know. In fact, I was going to ask you this. People like Liam Smith, Catherine Dupree Lumpkin, Willie Morris, Harry Cruz, all done these sort of conversion narratives, as they're called. Were you influenced at all by any of those? Did you read other memoirs?
I did not read any of those before. I've read them since, and I see lots of parallels. I've read Lillian Smith's. I haven't read the others that you mentioned.
There's a good one by Milton McLaurin, that history professor at UNC Wilmington, that also Eastern North Carolina, Wade in Cumberland County, that was exposed, unlike you, had actual experiences, encounters with individual blacks in that community because his father ran a store that catered to blacks.
That would make sense.
So he writes a separate chapter on each of several encounters with individuals that ultimately led him to the same sort of conversion that you come to in different ways. But what I think you do so well is really get at the essence of assessing those sources of that racism and the signals that were sent to, and often they're very subtle, even subliminal, aren't they?
Right.
There that I'm sure it's only in hindsight that you're able to recreate what those meant and how those sort of shaped the assumptions and the reality or your reality of what race meant by the time you were 11 or 12 years old there. And I wonder if we can talk about some of those a little. One, of course, is the N-word.
Right. I heard the word nigger used pervasively. And I know it's dangerous to say that word, and I'm not going to say it again. But I have heard, one of the things that I have heard over and over from people as I was talking to them about this book, especially white people, especially liberal white Southerners in particular. I would tell them that I was writing about these years, and I was writing about the process of dealing with one's racism. And one of the first things they would say in response was that, in my family, we were not allowed to use the N-word. And they offered this as sort of a, they didn't understand what they were saying. What they were really saying was, I was not part of the problem.
Yeah.
I was not a racist. My family was not a racist, and we were not raised to be racist. And what I started saying back to them after this had happened a few times was that, well, your mother probably told you not to say a lot of words, right? But you actually did say a lot of those words when you weren't around your mother. And really what your mother was trying to talk to you about was not tolerance of other people, it was about polite language. It was about these are words we can use with other people, and these are words that we don't use with other people. You
write so well about that as a client, the class dimension to it, that it had a lot to do with how you are, and parents having their children present themselves to. You're above the class of people that use that word so much.
Right. Well, that's one of the ways you achieve that kind of class mobility is to start to behave like the better kind of white people and not like the worst kind of white people, and to speak like them in particular. My mother was a stickler about grammar, and I think that's also common of people. You know, a lot of Southern mothers in that era corrected their children's grammar to make sure that they didn't say ain't, you know, and to make sure that they spoke like the people that the family aspired to be, right?
And there's a gender dimension to it too. I picked up in the fact that it is women that seem to have.
Well, women are the police of this whole system. The men are supposed to be socialized by the women. That's the myth that we have, right? That civilization comes into men through women.
Yeah. So you're hearing this much more from your mother than from your father.
Well, my father never said anything. My father was totally silent, unless he was yelling. You know, he had 2 volumes, silent and yelling, and that was about as good as he could get. He had an occasional middle volume, but we didn't hear that very much. He left all the child rearing, all of the education to my mom. But in that section where I write about the N-word, I wanted to shatter this notion that white people didn't use that word, or that good white people didn't use that word. Because in the community where I lived, I heard it from just about everybody at one time or another. Not from my teachers, certainly. But I have heard of cases where that word was used by white teachers in classrooms. But I did a 2-page section in which I listed every use of that word that I could remember.
Right.
Actually, when I was being interviewed on a black radio program, a gentleman read that passage back to me, and it was one of the hardest moments I think I've ever had.
Having to listen to it.
Having to listen to it. Being assaulted by that word over and over and over again. That was an amazing interview, an amazing conversation with people.
Oh, I can imagine.
But also in that section, I mean that the N-word was used in playground rhymes, and that's one of the earliest places where I would use it. One of the common switches that Southerners make is to take any kind of rhyme that has monkey in it also can have the N-word in it. So something like monkey, monkey, black as tar, stuck his head in a molasses jar. That was, we didn't say monkey on the playground when I was growing up. We said the other word.
I can remember that too.
You take things in while you're playing. You take things in as a child when you're listening to other adults and trying to figure the world out. You notice that there's when you start to be able to read, you notice there's a water fountain that says colored people and a water fountain that says white people. Just simple things like the way that white people enforce a social separation between themselves and black people, a total kind of separation when I was a child, teaches you the way that the world is supposed to operate.
And there's no reason for you to question that, is there?
No, there's absolutely none.
Nobody's
talking
not hearing
back
anybody
to you.
else question it.
Exactly. Until those girls in 6th grade started talking to me, I had I didn't hear the black side of the story at all. We weren't supposed to hear that. We were supposed to hear the myth, right? The things that we wanted to believe about black people. And we were supposed to be so thoroughly inculcated with those by the time we did have contact with black people, that those attitudes governed the way we behaved toward them. Now, there were exceptions, of course. The whole system of segregation was based on allowing exceptions. You can have a personal relationship with some black people. As a child, farmers might play with black children who were children of people who worked on the farm, for instance.
Harry Crews writes about that.
Right. The storekeeper thing that you mentioned, that makes sense also because, again, that's a place where black people and white people are supposed to interact to a degree. But And that goes all the way back in terms of the way I can read it to the plantation
Yeah,
era,
yeah.
when black children, the master's children might play with the black children up till a certain age, but then a certain kind of separation would be forced on them, and they would go their separate ways.
Mm-hmm. And maids and domestic servants were
Right.
often
Were childhood friends.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
But it was always interesting how much more maids knew about the white families they worked for than the white families ever knew.
Well,
or
that's
probably
because
cared about.
white people had we had this filter that we were seeing black people through. We were not seeing them for what they were. We were seeing what we wanted to see in them.
Yeah.
Whereas black people, in order to survive, had to see white people for what they were.
Yeah.
Absolutely, literally what they were.
Well, you write so well, devote a chapter to the very terms black and white,
Right.
and the multiple meanings there, and
That's
how
one of my
subtly
favorite
that too.
parts,
Yeah, can you talk a little about that?
Well, in church, the notion that sin, accepting Christ into your heart, becoming religious, washes you white as snow. Whereas if you're lost in sin, you're lost in blackness and darkness. That language led me, what I tried to do in that chapter was to meditate on the uses of black and white, not just in the church and not just in religion, but as symbols that run throughout our use of language, our poetry, our literature.
Right.
You know, we are nudged by the way we use language in a symbolic way to think of white and black as opposite, and to think of white as good and black as bad.
Right.
I give a lot of examples in the book, and I think I convinced myself I was wondering when I was writing that whether I was going to be able to get it into the book, and by the time I finished that chapter, I thought, no, it's essential to the book, because this is, I think, one of the places where intelligent people get co-opted by this message, by this notion that, and for me it also explains why it is that racism between white people and racism as white people practice it against black people is so much more virulent than the other kinds of racism against people of color. You know, and again, I dealt with this in the chapter called, I can't remember, where I talked about the boy who was too brown.
Oh, right, yeah. It could have been Mexican or Indian, sort of undefined.
Because when there were two school systems, white people framed black people as being so subhuman and so different that they would not force Asian kids or South Asians or Latino kids or Indian kids, for the most part, into schools with black kids. They were allowed to be part of the white school, but there was still a difference between the kids who were too brown and the kids who were truly white.
The very use of the term brown versus black, isn't it?
And in fact, it's when looking at that issue that you can see that the whole idea of whiteness is a construct. It's not a reality.
Right.
It was something that we assembled back in the 1600s in order to justify slavery to begin with.
Right.
Because there isn't, I mean, in certain eras of the country, Italians weren't quite white. You know, Greeks weren't quite white.
Mediterranean.
You know, Italian immigrants suffered a great deal of discrimination, and particularly in New Orleans and in port cities in the South, when they came over here. So whiteness has always been a kind of a fluid term, and it meant what we needed it to mean when we needed it to mean that. Right? It's not a real thing, which was a disturbing notion to come to when I realized that this thing that really was essential to my identity, the fact that I was a white person, was a fictional construct, a fiction of a different kind.
Right. Yeah. You have a great passage in that chapter saying that my lessons in racism came to me as part of my training in goodness.
Yeah.
so tangled with that message. It would be years, but I would be years in making sense of it.
Right.
But the very fact that it's it's good people often that are teaching these lessons.
Oh, yeah.
And in every other way, you have no reason to set that up or to think of that in any terms that.
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to go right at the notion that good white people are not racist.
Right.
Because that's not really true.
Yeah.
Good white people are, unfortunately, there is, the way people compartmentalize themselves, you can be a good person and still practice racism to some degree or another.
Right, and that
I
comes
also
through.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that comes through in so many ways here. That,
I also wanted to separate. I mean, there's no great violent acts of racism in this book. This is a much quieter book.
Right.
And some people ask me about that as I've talked about it, and I told them, well, first of all, the book's true to what I knew. These kinds of things didn't happen where I grew up. But more to the point, one of the ways that people protect themselves from understanding their own racism is by thinking, well, I was never a hate-driven bigot. I never participated in a beating of a black man.
Right.
I never ran a black family out of their homes.
Burned a cross.
Right, never burned a cross in the yard, never lynched anybody.
Yeah.
So I'm not part of the problem. But you are part of the problem if you have not examined this stuff in yourself. Yeah. If you have not done if you haven't gone through your own conversion narrative, basically.
Right.
If you haven't seen and understood these things in yourself, you are still part of the problem. Yeah. And even after that, you're still part of the problem if you don't maintain, you don't get rid of racism. It doesn't go away. It's something that you have to live with. It's something that you have to set your mind to deal with all the time.
And to acknowledge it. That's a big first step, as Absolutely. It is with. And I think that's, in some ways, the real power of autobiography, particularly in Southern history, that it is these subtleties, it's these minor things that psychological, emotional sort of ways in which they're not going to show up in the history textbooks that are all big events, turning points there. And I think that's what makes this book in particular so powerful, is that you are getting at realities that all of us of that generation faced in one way or another. I think it works well. Speaking of that, I was thinking of that one incident that you've mentioned already, when I think you were 6 years old on the bus, seeing your brother in this fight with the black boy. I wonder if you can talk about that a little, and then maybe read that final paragraph of that chapter, which is page 86. I think you summed that up so interestingly. You're getting back to that hierarchy of place that you've talked about.
Well, we got off the bus that day. This was definitely something that happened in the first grade, because that's when we lived in the house. And my brother was just having a fight with a little black kid about his size. And
he was how much older?
No, he was younger than me.
Oh, your brother was younger?
My brother was younger than me. So this was like the kind of, it was really like watching two kittens fight. I mean, they weren't hurting each other. They were just wrestling and throwing each other down on the ground and rolling over and over again. I couldn't really tell if they were really mad with each other or if they were just kind of fighting by instinct. It was a very curious moment. They would separate for a couple of seconds, and then they'd go right back at it again. And then I walked up to the house, and that's when I saw the older black woman. She must have been the grandmother of the child. They would have been maybe 4 or 5 years old, most likely about 4, because I was 6 at the time, and my brother's 2 years younger than me. And my brother was enjoying himself, because he couldn't fight with me. He couldn't fight with my younger brother because we both had hemophilia. He had skipped him. So he didn't get to do much rough and tumble stuff, but he was getting to do it that day. So he was pretending to be mad, but he was also enjoying himself. Because he didn't have to hold back with that kid, and that kid certainly wasn't holding back with him. Let me just read this. I had already I had learned already to see the world in terms of many types of difference, but particularly between rich and poor, black and white, decent and not. Country people made a life's work of deciding who was better than whom and what was better than what. Judged were families, individuals, members of families, churches, members of churches, denominations, villages, towns, makes of automobile, ways of canning, recipes for slaw, and on and on. The world was a grand hierarchy of such rankings. When necessary, the process of judgment could be bloody and mean. I would never entirely force that process, that need to decide who was above and who was below, out of my thinking, and it would be a long time before I even tried.
Yeah, I think that says so much there. You're really summing up a lot of how the class dimension is very much a part of the race problem and the racial perceptions. And
Well, I'm still struck by that when I go back home. The degree to which women talk about each other. Oh, I wouldn't eat anything that comes out of her kitchen.
Oh, really?
I've been to her house. I've seen she doesn't keep clean. And that's not racial. That's just simply the way women judge each other.
Yeah.
You know, oh, she doesn't take care of her children at all. That house is so dirty when I go over there. You know. And the men do the same thing. I just don't hear them do it quite as openly.
It's in many ways a small town mentality,
absolutely
isn't it?
a small town
and rural.
mentality.
No, I think that's really powerful.
It's not just pettiness either, because there's a certain amount of self-preservation in it. You really don't want to eat food out of somebody's kitchen
that's true.
When it's filthy.
Those slaw recipes.
Right.
It really comes down to some pretty petty stuff, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, you devote another chapter to your father, who was, he could also be a fighter. There. Very masculine, very assertive. I wonder if you can talk about that and how that related to both the race and class hierarchies that you were beginning to discern at that point.
There was a day when my mother was tending to some wounds on my father. I remember I might have been second or third grade at that point. Was a Sunday morning, and he'd been out all night with his buddies, and he'd gotten in some kind of fight. And she was being very careful with him because she was dressing his wounds, but she also didn't want him to get mad at her if she hurt him too much. Because she was putting merthiolate on the wounds, or maybe it was alcohol. What I was trying to get at in that chapter was that my father was of a class and of a personality type with the kind of temper that could turn on a dime. And that was not at all unique in that community. That was the way a lot of men were socialized to be. And while I don't know for certain, I expect there was a racial component to some of the trouble my father got into. It would not surprise me to find out that he had some association with white gangs. And the larger point that I was trying to make is that this is the kind of person who was needed in order to do the dirty work of racism. This was the kind of man you needed, angry, ready to hit, comfortable with communicating with his fists, thoroughly indoctrinated in what a white person is supposed to be and how different that is supposed to be than a black person. You need a lot of those people if you're going to maintain a system of terror, which is essentially what racism was when it showed its uglier sides. You know, there was the social aspect, the everyday aspect, but if a black person crossed the line in public, then the punishment had to be meted out by somebody, and it was men like my father who did that.
Well, the final paragraph there, too, on 106 is, I wonder if you'd mind reading that, because, again, I think you make that point so well.
I would own I would only have known the personal edge of this at the time, the fact that my father and the men around me were all kings of their castles, empowered to act as they saw fit in their houses and on their land. I would only have known that living with my father was like living with a fire that could barely be controlled. But later I would learn all about all the cruelties and inhumanities of slavery and Jim Crow, including lynchings, rapes, beatings, torture, forced labor, and much more. And later still I would understand these atrocities had been practiced in Jones County and in the region around me at one time or another, practiced by people much like those I knew, by men like my father and his drinking buddies, by good folk like those with whom I went to church, by people like me.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And that sense of history is slow in coming, isn't it?
Yeah.
As it would be for all children, certainly at that age there.
Yeah.
But you write about your first exposure to the Civil War and understanding the Civil War comes from Walt Disney. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
So funny.
Yeah.
People may remember the Walt Disney movie Johnny Shiloh, which was about a little Union drummer boy.
This was on the Walt Disney
on
television.
The Walt Disney television show on Sunday nights.
Yeah.
It was a 90-minute, about a 90-minute movie. The story is that this, and it's based on a historical person, Johnny Shiloh, who became a drummer for a Union company. He was captured by Southerners, and in the movie he becomes friends with a Southern boy, and they realize they're on different sides, and they make friends anyway, and then later on they meet in battle, and everything's just sort of cool and nice the way it is in Disney movies.
Yeah.
And I watched it. The same actor who played Johnny Tyler had been in a movie called Toby Tyler that I really loved. You know, the one where he runs away to be in the circus, and everybody has that dream. So I already liked the kid. And we were talking about the movie, my brothers and sisters, and we really liked it, and we really liked Abraham Lincoln. And my mother listened to this for a while, and she said, "You all need to know that we were not on that side of that war when it was actually happening, and you wouldn't have liked Abraham Lincoln very much if you'd lived in that time." She said it more succinctly, but I can't really remember the words that she used. But what she was warning us is that, you know, you all live in Jones County, and you need not be talking too well about Abraham Lincoln.
Well, and there was nothing in the movie that dealt with the causes of the war or the issues involved.
In fact, there wasn't a single mention of slavery in the war at all, and I don't think there were any black people in the movie, which is kind of remarkable about a movie that pretends to be about the Civil War. I got a copy of that movie and watched it so that I could write when I was writing that chapter, and it's just a piece of fluff.
Yeah. Well, that's one I don't remember. I need to go back and look at it myself. I don't know why I missed that one.
You'd be very amused by it.
Well, I'm certainly a big fan of Walt Disney, and certainly remember Toby Tyler and
but
Johnny Tremaine.
But Walt Disney does make real. He does homogenize history.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, he takes the easy way out.
Yeah.
It's all about entertainment and feeling good.
But it raised the question to me how, even in high school, how was the Civil War taught? Do you have any memory of at what point you did begin to realize what?
By the time I was in high school, schools were fully integrated, and our classes were 2/3 black students.
Yeah.
So I don't recall being taught much about the Civil War at all. I think maybe, you know, I didn't think about this when I was writing the book, and I would have explored it if I had, but I'm wondering whether there was some change in the way that particular piece of history was taught during that era, because it would have been a very volatile subject in our high school, and I don't recall it being taught at all. I remember world history, but I don't remember much about American history. Right. We took a lot of civics.
Yeah, we did too. I remember that. Yeah.
But we didn't go through that Civil War narrative at all. What I remember about it from elementary school was being taught the standard thing that slavery existed, but that it was really okay.
Yeah,
And that
very benign.
everybody did it,
Right.
and there were good masters, and slaves were very well treated, and they were much better off as slaves than they were as savages on the plains of Africa or in the jungles of Africa, and all that stuff that we know is not true.
Yeah, no, I've heard the same thing. Yeah.
And I have taken a look at a couple of textbooks from the 30s where that's actually taken to a point that's absolutely ridiculous. It's a really interesting exercise to look at the material that was used to teach history.
Oh, it is, yeah. We've had a student do a master's thesis on Georgia history textbooks through the years, and what's emphasized and not, both with slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, all of that, gets remarkably little coverage and very benign in what it is. Well, this brings us back to the chronology of your schooling. It was in 1968,
right,
8th grade, that the two dual systems, black and white, collapsed into one, and big changes come at that point, but particularly because it's a majority black county and therefore a black school system. Can you talk about that you're suddenly put in the position of being a part of a minority rather than the majority?
That was a fascinating few years to live through. I don't think white people were really aware. Maybe I suspect the adults were, but the kids were not aware that we were actually a minority in Jones County.
Huh.
And then
until that point?
Until that point.
Yeah.
And then, because that's the first years when black people actually began to assert themselves at the voting place.
Oh, right.
Because they had been kept away from voting before the Voting Rights Act.
Of 65.
Which was in the same era.
Yeah.
So at the same time that black adults are asserting themselves at the polls, integration comes along, white children flee to the private schools, and so the public schools became, the majority in the county, the black majority in the county was about 60-40. The black majority in the schools was more like 70-30. We were very much a minority in the schools. And so the sort of swagger that the white boys in particular had during elementary school, during those years of freedom of choice, disappeared because they had to be careful of what they said.
Yeah.
We had to be careful of what we said.
It's a very different dynamic, wasn't it?
Right. There was still a good bit of back and forth conversation, particularly during the Nixon-Humphrey Wallace election of 1968, which was also that first year.
Right.
But we had a very good teacher who brought a lot of those issues in a very healthy way. He was the principal of that. It would be called a middle school now. I don't want to say his name because the only name I can remember is his real one. But he was very good at opening up discussions.
This was the black
teacher that we had.
Yeah, Wexler's the name he used.
Wexler, okay, yeah, all right. Well, Mr. Wexler was very good at his job. He was also a Nixon supporter.
Yeah, which is curious, isn't it?
Well, it wasn't curious to him. He was passionate about it. He didn't like Hubert Humphrey. He didn't particularly like the Democrats. I think one of the things we do as white people to pigeonhole black people is to think that black people should never vote Republican. And that's a silly attitude. People are people, and they have a right to their opinions. But he made us talk about the election, and so he and I were debating each other. And I was a Humphrey supporter, he was a Nixon supporter, and the white kids were talking about Wallace, and somehow he made that all okay to talk about.
Yeah.
But the schools, that first year was very cold and sort of edgy. We sort of retreated back into our safe groups. I hung out mostly with the white kids, although I did, I I was less aggressively friendly, but I was still open to the black kids and would have conversations with them, but I didn't seek them out. Partly because it just felt too dangerous that first year. There was a lot of anger being expressed. Not through fighting, but through verbal stuff.
Yeah. And there was some natural segregation going on there when it was in the school in terms of tracking.
Yeah, right.
College prep courses tended to be whiter.
This was when the other layer of segregation was starting to assert itself in the public schools. People were maintaining sort of white classrooms through tracking processes. You know, I was on a college track, which meant that in most of my classes, there were. Now this was truer in high school. This was not true in the eighth grade in that first year, because we were not separated into tracks in that first year. But once I got into high school, I was mostly in classes with white kids. We were in that the minority majority situation would be reversed. There would be about 60% white kids, 40% black kids on the college preparatory track.
I thought the lunch thing was interesting. I'd never heard that before.
You mean taking our lunches to school?
Children didn't eat in the lunchroom. White students didn't.
Yeah. This went away by the time we went to high school. My mother got tired of packing lunches, and she just said, get over yourselves.
Yeah.
But we were all under pressure in that first year of complete integration to toe the line and not to cross the social separation between black and white kids too much. I had been really good friends with Violet and Rhonda and Ursula, but once they got back among their black friends, they drew back a little bit. I pulled back a little bit. In the lunchroom, all of the white kids sat together, and there was just enough of us to fill out one table. The school we were going to had been the black elementary school, and it had been so poorly funded and built that they had to eat their lunches in the library. Oh. Right? So that's where we all ate our lunches, and there were just enough of us to fill one of those library tables. And we all brought our lunch.
And that was because you didn't want to have to go through the line.
Right. Didn't want to eat the food that the black women had prepared in the cafeteria. And it had to have been an agreement on the part of the adults, because all of a sudden, none of us had ever brought lunches before. And all of us were bringing little brown bag lunches during that entire year.
That was interesting.
Right.
The busing was also interesting, the seating on school buses.
Oh, yeah. The black kids sat at the front of the bus. They were not going to be put at the back of the bus. This was well after Rosa Parks had made her stand. So, but we were fairly comfortable with that. The buses, though, were torments for some kids. North Carolina in those years did not have professional bus drivers.
Oh, that's right.
North Carolina had students to do the buses, to drive the buses to and from school. Some of the bus drivers were good at the discipline, and some of them weren't. And depending on the mix of kids on the bus and the particular kids on the bus, I've heard pretty horrid incidents about the way some girls were treated on the buses. I never heard of any actual fights, although I think there probably were some. But the buses were probably us at our worst. Now,
these were long rides coming from all over the county to the
we never heard anything about busing being bad. We had to be bused because there was only one high school.
No option.
Right? It was a 10-mile ride from my house to the high school. Excuse me.
Well, you were part of a committee, a student committee, a human relations committee, which is interesting that the administration would turn over, at least in an advisory capacity, so many of these big decisions.
Well, it got them off the hook for them.
Oh, that's...
And it enabled them to say, well, we had, both black and white students and faculty.
One from each class,
One
wasn't
from
it?
each class, right.
One black, one white student on
Yeah.
this committee.
Yeah.
And what was the issues that you all were dealing with?
The issues were homecoming queen, how to elect the student body president, and the valedictorian speech for graduation. And we made a lot of decisions that I think were pretty questionable. So we were used to make some choices, but we were not actually used to create a dialogue, which actually would have helped quite a lot.
Yeah.
And we decided, for instance, that the homecoming queen would not be voted on because whichever race won the homecoming queen, the other race would be petulant about it, or maybe worse. And there were a lot of examples around us of high schools that were blowing up and having violent incidents related to cheerleaders and homecoming queens. So we made it a fundraising.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
A fundraising process. The candidate who could raise the most money would become homecoming queen. And of course that gave the advantages to the white kids because they had the access to money.
More funding, yeah.
And we made the decision that having I can't even remember exactly what the discussion was, but there was some discomfort at the thought that black kids might suffer from disadvantages in terms of the way they had been educated and they could not compete for valedictorian. So we would not have the valedictorian speak at graduation. We would have the student body president speak at graduation.
And that was often a black student, wasn't it?
Yeah,
You
the student
mentioned
body
a couple
president
of
was,
those,
yeah. Now, I was actually the student body president my senior year. I didn't put this in
I was going to say.
because I resigned.
Oh.
Family, that was the year my mother and father finally divorced.
Oh, yeah.
So my vice president was a black woman, and she took the speech for me. And that just seemed too convoluted to put into the book. So.
Well, that's interesting, though. Yeah, and some interracial dating going on.
Oh yeah, I was
you were
an
a close friend
enabler with that. Yeah, there was a group. The way the high school fell out was similar to the way the elementary school classroom had fallen out in terms of division. There was a certain set of kids. There were black and white kids who really didn't want to mix, and so they kept to themselves, established their own little turfs in the high school, and held on to them. And then there was a group of us in the middle who did want to mix. So there was an integrated group of people who were friends, and we hung out with each other, and we had lunch with each other sometimes, and we hung out on the smoking patio sometimes. The smoking patio was the cool place to be. You know, I never
Cigarettes
smoked.
brought you together.
Right. And so within the integrated group of friends, of course, romances started to happen, and I was privy to 3 or 4 of them, and helped one of my friends, Mercy, in the book, to date the boy that she was going out with. We didn't realize how dangerous all that was.
Well, most of it was pretty secret, wasn't it? They
it was
even
very
realized,
secret.
too, that they couldn't do this in any public
But there was one
places.
time when we went to get Mercy's boyfriend from his house, and he tried to sneak out of the house, and his mother was right on top of him and got him back in the house immediately. And we didn't understand that we would have been fine, but he might have been killed if he'd been caught with Roxanne.
It was almost always black boys with white girls, wasn't it?
Not always.
Oh,
no.
I was thinking of...
there were a couple of incidences of white boys and black girls.
Yeah. You make an interesting point regarding the tension seemed to be less between the black and white students than it was between the black students and the white adults, teachers.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the one incident that led to a walkout by the black students?
There were actually 2 incidents. There were two years running. We had winter walkouts in the school. The first incident was a teacher said something very derogatory about the black kids. He was a shop teacher, somebody who hadn't been hired at the school for very long. and the students made a big deal about it. The white people called these riots. The black kids called them demonstrations. And the same language carried over into the adult communities. And then the next year, a black teacher was fired.
Oh, that's right.
And the black students protested his being let go because they said he was actually a good teacher.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this was an era in which, in order to preserve white teacher jobs, a lot of black teachers were being let go.
Right.
Most of them with the excuse that they were not qualified to be. They'd been qualified to teach in a segregated school system, but once the schools were integrated, they were no longer qualified.
Yeah, you only had 2 or maybe 3
I only remember 2 or 3 black teachers. But there were more than that in the high school. It's just that because I was on the college preparatory track, most of those teachers were white teachers.
Yeah. That's often something that goes.
That's still
nobody's done much with black teachers, the fate of black teachers with immigration. They became such victims of that. Well, you say something very interesting. I might just read these 2 sentences here that you say. For everyone, there was a certain degree of bitterness involved in the realization that the consolidation of the black and white school systems had likely caused as many problems as it had solved. This need not have been the case. Had the adults all chosen to accept and support the new schools, our county would have been a different place. It's certain that segregation had to end, and equally certain that the end could have come about in a better way.
Yeah.
That's one of the big lessons I think that come across in this.
Well, what happened if you were a black kid was you lost the safe haven of a black school where you didn't have to deal with race.
And that was often a community center for the black community that was lost as well, wasn't it? Yeah. And then the segregation academies pulled a large chunk of the white students out of the schools.
Right, and pulled a lot of the support of those parents out of the schools.
Yeah.
And that's continued and had its repercussions through today.
Yeah, that's true. These have been long
One of the reasons
effects.
legislatures are willing to defund public education is because they have established a very elaborate system of private schools.
Yeah.
Basically, as I say in the book, we've privatized segregation.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, not all these black schools are segregated. They can't be if they're getting any kind of federal funding. But I would bet you that a study would show that the majority of them are majority white.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if we could maybe finish up by talking a little about your own post-high school career. Going to Chapel Hill as an undergraduate. Yeah. And then can you talk about your career since? Were you an English major?
I was an English major. I studied creative writing with Doris Betts and Max Steele, very fine writers who taught there at Chapel Hill.
I had Doris too. I was a graduate student
at
Chapel
really?
Hill.
Oh, that's great.
Louis Rubin.
Oh, yeah. I had him for about 2 weeks. He scared me.
He was a curmudgeon, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He had a reputation for not liking gay folks.
Oh, really?
I don't know whether it was earned or not, but it was a rumor at the time.
Interesting, yeah.
But I loved Chapel Hill. I had a really great time while I was there. Moved on from there to New Orleans.
Oh, right.
Because I figured, I finally started coming out in college, and coming out as a gay person, I mean. And I decided I wanted to, it was only in college that I realized that there were actually quite a few other gay people. I didn't think there were that many of us, because in Jones County I never heard anything about anybody being gay. So I moved to New Orleans to try to figure out what gay people were like and what my place was in all that. I quickly realized that I was going to drink myself to death on cheap booze if I stayed in New Orleans, so I moved to Atlanta, where I met a lot of people who were involved in theater and in the arts. I started publishing short fiction while I was in New Orleans, started writing plays when I came to Atlanta, and got involved with people at 7 Stages and made a home for myself for 20-odd years as a playwright there. I think I can't remember how many plays I did there, but it was 10 or 12, something like that. And 7 Stages actually gave me the connection that led to the publication of my first novel, Winter Birds, in Germany.
Yeah.
And from that point on,
You couldn't find a publisher.
I couldn't find an
Nobody would
English
take it
language
on.
publisher.
Yeah.
I had been trying for about
Yeah.
10 years
Yeah.
to publish it here. A German publisher translated and published it in Germany, and then they found Algonquin Books and convinced them to publish it. Now, of course, Algonquin had rejected that book 10 years before they accepted it, so it was one of those satisfying kind of stories.
Was Louis Rubin still involved with it at that time?
Louis had just left and sold the company to Workman Publishing at that point. Yeah. And I wasn't scared of him anymore. In fact, we got to be kind of friendly in later years. I misjudged him when I was a teenager. I should have stayed in
Well,
his
that's
class.
easy to see why you had those impressions.
Well, he wanted to intimidate people. He loved to intimidate
did.
people. And he was about 6'4". And he was used to being the king of the room, whatever room he was in. So.
Well, that was Winter Birds, wasn't it?
That was Winter Birds.
Was that your most autobiographical?
Yeah.
Or based on your own experience?
That is the most
life
directly autobiographical.
Yeah.
And I wrote another couple of books based on family material, but I fictionalized those books more. But the Winter Birds is directly autobiographical, although there's a great deal of fiction in it. Right. It's not a memoir. People have asked me sometimes. Some people say they think it ought to be considered a memoir, and I tell them, well, you know, you're not really giving the notion of autobiographical fiction its due, because there's no way I'd ever call Winter Birds a memoir, because there's too much stuff in it that's made up.
Yeah.
The fact that all the incidents in it are true doesn't make up for the fact that the timeline is completely different, and I've compressed all those events, and I've changed them, and I've changed the family makeup. And, so.
When did you end up in Emory?
1998, they had a job opening, and Ha Jin was there at that point.
Oh, yeah.
We had become friends, and he encouraged me to apply for the job there, and then he advocated for me, and the folks there liked me, and so they hired me, and I've been there ever since.
That's great. And you teach creative writing?
I teach creative writing. I teach playwriting and fiction. And I'll probably start teaching creative nonfiction.
I was just going to ask. Now that that's become a... Well, I wonder if you could end by talking about your 40th reunion. I think that's an interesting story.
The 40th high school reunion, I had the idea that that would be a good way to end the book, so I went to it. And as it turned out...
That was 2013, wasn't it?
2013. I was... there were 2 nights of events. One was a memorial service for class members who had passed away. And the next night was the banquet, the reunion banquet. There were 3 white students and about 40 or 50 black students who returned to the memorial service. And then at the banquet, I was the only white student there. Did
that surprise you? Were you caught off guard by that?
No. It's hard to be surprised by something that says... I was surprised for a minute, and then I thought, well, why did I think this was going to be any other way? Right? You know, I don't want to read too much into that, and I tried not to read too much into it as I wrote about it, but it was an inescapable fact. But the network of students who put the reunion together was all black, and I don't think the white students either felt like they needed to go or felt included by it. What they've told me as I've asked them about it, because they're sort of embarrassed now because I wrote about that in the book, was that, well, they were just asking for too much money, and there wasn't a whole lot people were getting for that money. And the senior class president, who was, of course, one of the people responsible for putting the event together, asked me where the white kids were, and were we having a separate white reunion, and I told him I certainly didn't know that one. But that, I think I've heard from other people that there are separate black and white reunions for their high school. They're not quite they're less formal when they're held that way, but there's still a deep social divide between black people and white people here.
Well, that certainly speaks to that, doesn't it? Does it have is it any indication of how many of the black students stayed in Jones County versus whites that left? Or
no, there's still quite a lot of white students around
that
there.
did stay.
I'm in touch with quite a few of
Yeah.
them, and they're all within. There are at least as many white kids there as black kids there. I mean, a lot of kids of both races moved away and didn't go back. There were several of my black friends who returned from other places to go to the reunion. I know if I had gotten in touch with people, more white kids would have gone.
They didn't want to be the only ones.
Probably. And since I knew I was going to end up writing about it, I didn't want to skew the story. I wanted to let events unfold the way they were going to unfold.
Well, it makes for a very sobering conclusion.
It was. It was a sobering event to go to.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. But it was still fun. It was fun to see all those kids.
Yeah. Well, that says a lot about you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I've really enjoyed this. And
I have too.
Really enjoyed the book. I just think it's a
Thank
powerful book, and it's even a very teachable book.
Yeah.
I think to center on those high school years or something that high school students and even college students will identify with on so much different levels and different times, of course. But
I think it's a really important story, the story of integration.
Yeah,
to
I
tell
do too.
As many times as somebody's willing to tell it.
Right.
So.
And as I always say about autobiography, nobody reads it we don't read it for the typical necessarily.
Right.
And in so many ways, this was so different from our experience in Western North Carolina.
Yeah.
But there's a lot I also identify with, and I'm sure anybody of that generation would.
Well, that's good.
See variables there that are revealing. So,
yeah.
very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
Thank you for having me.